Mrs. Hayes, did you receive the monthly transfers your husband arranged before he passed? The question was simple, almost polite, but it landed in the room like something heavy and out of place, something that didn't belong at a quiet while reading on a Tuesday morning. I remember blinking, once, then twice, because for a moment I thought I had misheard him. Monthly transfers. The words didn't fit into my life, not the one I had been living for the past 2 years. I'm sorry, I said, my voice steady but distant to my own ears. What transfers? Across the polished oak table, I saw it then, just for a second. Victoria's fingers tightened around the leather strap of her handbag. It was small, almost nothing, but it was enough. The lawyer, Mr. Bennett, paused, his expression shifting ever so slightly, like a man recalculating something in his head. Your husband set up a series of monthly payments for your support, he said carefully. They've been processed consistently since his passing. The room went quiet in a way I hadn't noticed before, like the air itself had been holding its breath. I turned my head slowly toward my son. Michael was sitting to my right, his posture stiff, his gaze fixed somewhere just past the edge of the table. He didn't look at me. He didn't speak. And in that silence, something inside me, something small but precise, began to move. Because for the past 2 years, I had been counting every dollar. I had been choosing between refilling my prescription and fixing the heater when it broke in the middle of January. I had been telling myself that my son was busy, that life in the city was expensive, that young couples had their own burdens. I had never once imagined that anything had been set aside for me. Not once. There must be some mistake, I said quietly. My hands were folded neatly in my lap, the way they always were when I needed to keep them from trembling. I haven't received anything. Another silence. Heavier this time. Mr. Bennett glanced down at the folder in front of him, flipping a page with slow precision. The transfers were authorized under your name, he said. Direct deposits. Beginning the month after your husband's funeral. $1,200 every month. 1,200. I felt the number more than I heard it. It echoed somewhere behind my ribs, hollow and sharp at the same time. I did the math without meaning to. 2 years. 24 months. That was nearly $30,000. Money that could have changed everything. Money that could have meant warmth in the winter, fresh groceries without counting pennies, a little less worry at the end of each month. And yet, I had lived as though it didn't exist. I turned my head again, slower this time. Michael, I said, his name soft but clear. He shifted in his seat, just slightly. I thought you were getting it, Mom, he said, finally looking at me, but only for a moment. His eyes didn't stay. They never did anymore. That's what we were told. We. The words settled into place quietly. I didn't need to ask who he meant. Victoria adjusted her posture then, smoothing the front of her tailored cream blouse as if nothing at all had happened. Her smile, when it appeared, was practiced, gentle, almost concerned. There's probably just been some kind of administrative mix-up, she said, her voice light, controlled. These things happen all the time with banks. I nodded slowly, as if I agreed, as if that explanation made perfect sense. But I was no longer listening to her words. I was watching the space between them. The timing. The way she had spoken just a fraction too quickly, as though she had been waiting for the moment to arrive. Of course, I said softly. A mix-up. Mr. Bennett didn't speak again right away. He was looking at me now, more carefully than before, like he was trying to understand something beyond the paperwork in front of him. Mrs. Hayes, he said after a moment, would you be willing to review the transaction records with me after this meeting? I smiled then, not because anything was amusing, but because it felt like the appropriate response. Yes, I said. I think that would be a very good idea. And as I sat there, in that quiet room with its polished table and carefully arranged documents, I felt something settle into place inside me. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder than that. Something clearer. For the first time in a long while, I realized I had not been forgotten. I had been managed. And the difference between those two things was everything. That evening, I set the table the same way I always did, even though I knew it would only be the three of us. The plates were placed evenly, the silverware aligned, the glasses polished until they caught the soft light above the dining table. Routine has a way of keeping things steady, even when nothing else feels certain. I had invited Michael and Victoria to dinner earlier that afternoon, my voice calm, my words simple. Come by around 6, I had said. I made your favorite. There had been a brief pause on the other end of the line before Michael agreed, his tone distracted but agreeable. Now, as I adjusted the napkin beside his plate, I thought about that pause. It had been small, almost nothing, but I had started to notice those things now. The clock on the wall read 6:15 when I heard the front door open. "Mom," Michael called out, his voice carrying through the hallway. "In the dining room," I replied. They walked in together, Victoria slightly ahead, as she often was. She smiled when she saw the table, her expression warm and practiced. "This looks beautiful," she said, glancing around. "You always do this so nicely." "It is nothing special," I said, returning her smile. "Just dinner." Michael pulled out his chair and sat down, loosening his tie slightly as he did. "Smells great," he added, though his eyes did not linger on the food for long. They moved instead, briefly, toward the envelope I had placed neatly beside my plate. I noticed it. I noticed everything now. We began eating, the conversation light, almost careful. Work, traffic, a new restaurant Victoria had been wanting to try. Ordinary things. Safe things. If someone had walked into the room at that moment, they would have seen a perfectly normal family dinner. They would not have noticed the way Michael avoided looking directly at me, or the way Victoria spoke just a fraction too quickly when the silence stretched longer than expected. Halfway through the meal, I reached for my glass of water and set it back down with quiet precision. "I met with Mr. Bennett today," I said. The effect was immediate, though subtle. Michael's fork paused for a second before continuing. Victoria's smile did not disappear, but it changed, just slightly, like a photograph that had been adjusted by a single degree. "Oh," she said lightly. "How did that go?" I nodded once, as if the question were ordinary. "He showed me the records," I replied. I did not say more than that. I did not need to. Silence filled the space between us, heavier now, more deliberate. Michael cleared his throat. "Yeah, I have been meaning to talk to you about that," he said, his voice careful. "There must have been some confusion with the account setup." Confusion. The word echoed in my mind the same way it had earlier that day. I looked at him then, fully, holding his gaze just long enough for him to notice. "Yes," I said softly. "That is what I thought too." Victoria set her fork down gently, folding her hands together on the table. "These things can get complicated," she added, her tone measured, "especially when there are multiple accounts involved. Sometimes paperwork gets routed incorrectly." I watched her as she spoke, not the words themselves, but the way she chose them. Carefully, strategically, as if each one had been selected in advance. "I see," I said. Then I reached for the envelope. The room seemed to grow quieter as I opened it, the sound of paper against paper louder than it should have been. I slid a single sheet out and placed it on the table, turning it so they could both see. "This is the account number listed for the transfers," I said. Michael leaned forward slightly, his eyes scanning the page. Victoria did not move at first. Then, slowly, she leaned in as well. There it was again, that small, almost invisible shift in her expression. It passed quickly, too quickly for anyone who was not looking for it. But I was. "Do you recognize it?" I asked. My voice remained calm, steady, unchanged. Michael frowned, his brow tightening as he looked at the numbers. "It looks familiar," he said. I think it might be the account we used a few years ago, before we switched banks. Before we switched." Another detail, another piece. Victoria nodded immediately. "That makes sense," she said. "If the estate documents were not updated, the funds could have been going to an old account." Could have been. The phrase settled between us, incomplete. I folded my hands together again, resting them lightly on the table. "An old account," I repeated. "That no longer exists." Michael hesitated. "I mean, it should have been closed," he said, uncertainty creeping into his voice. "But I would have to check." I nodded once more, as if his answer were sufficient. "Of course," I said. Then I smiled, the same small, polite smile I had used for years. "You should check." And in that moment, I saw it clearly. Not in the documents, not in the numbers, but in them. In the way Michael searched for explanations he did not fully believe. In the way Victoria filled the silence before it could settle too deeply. In the space between what was said and what was not. I picked up my fork again and continued eating, as though nothing at all had changed. But everything had. Because now, I was no longer wondering where the money had gone. I was watching how they were going to explain it. After they left that night, I did not clean the table right away. The plates remained where they were, the glasses half full, the faint scent of dinner still lingering in the air. I sat there alone, my hands resting lightly against the edge of the table, and let the silence settle around me. It was a different kind of silence now. Not empty, not lonely. It felt precise, like something waiting to be understood. I replayed the conversation in my mind, not the words themselves, but the spaces between them. Michael's hesitation, Victoria's timing, the way she had answered before he could finish forming a thought. It was subtle, but it was consistent. And consistency, I had learned over the years, was never accidental. I stood up slowly and began clearing the table, one plate at a time. The routine was familiar, almost comforting. Washington dry, put away. Simple actions that required no thinking. But my mind was not quiet. It was organizing, sorting, connecting things I had not connected before. Because this was not the first time something had felt slightly off. I just had not allowed myself to see it clearly. I dried my hands on a towel and leaned lightly against the kitchen counter, my gaze drifting toward the window. Outside, the street was calm, the same as it always was at this hour. A porch light across the way flickered on. A car passed slowly, its headlights gliding across the pavement. Everything looked ordinary. And yet, nothing felt that way anymore. I thought back to small moments. Moments I had dismissed at the time because they did not seem important enough to question. The way Victoria had once insisted on helping me organize my mail shortly after my husband passed, gently suggesting that it might be overwhelming for me to manage everything alone. I had been grateful then, tired, grieving, willing to accept help without asking too many questions. She had sat at this very table, sorting envelopes into neat stacks, her movements efficient, her tone reassuring. "We will make sure everything is taken care of," she had said. I remember nodding, trusting her completely. Then there were the times Michael had mentioned switching banks. It had come up casually, in passing conversations. "It is just easier this way," he had said. "Everything is in one place." I had not thought much of it. Why would I? He was my son. And Victoria, she had always presented herself as someone organized, capable, attentive. The kind of person who handled details so others did not have to. I walked back into the dining room and picked up the empty glasses, carrying them to the sink. The sound of running water filled the space, steady and consistent. I watched it for a moment, letting the rhythm of it settle my thoughts. Because the truth was not something that had appeared suddenly that morning. It had been there, quietly shaping things over time. I just had not been looking for it. I turned off the faucet and dried the last glass, placing it carefully on the rack. Then I reached for my purse, opening it slowly and taking out the envelope Mr. Bennett had given me. The papers inside felt heavier now, not because of what they contained, but because of what they represented. I spread them out on the table again, my eyes moving over the numbers with more intention this time. Dates, amounts, patterns. Everything was consistent. Too consistent. There were no missed months, no irregular transfers, no sign of error, which meant this was not a mistake. It was a system, and systems require design. I sat down and folded my hands together, resting them lightly on top of the documents. I did not feel angry. Not yet. Anger is loud. It demands immediate action, immediate confrontation. And that was not what this required. What this required was patience. Because if this had been happening for 2 years, then it had been done carefully, thoughtfully. And anything built that way does not unravel all at once. It reveals itself piece by piece, if you are willing to look closely enough. I glanced toward the doorway, half expecting to hear footsteps, though I knew no one was coming back. The house was quiet again, but it did not feel empty. It felt observant, as if it, too, had been watching all along. I allowed myself a small, measured breath. Then another. I would not rush this. I would not confront them tomorrow or the next day. I would not give them the chance to adjust their story before I understood it fully. Because whatever had been happening, it had not been impulsive. It had been planned. And plans leave traces. You just have to know where to look. I gathered the papers neatly and slid them back into the envelope, placing it carefully on the table in front of me. For the first time since my husband passed, I felt something shift inside me that had nothing to do with grief. It was quieter than that. Sharper. A kind of clarity that does not ask permission before it arrives. I stood up, turned off the lights, and made my way upstairs, my steps steady, unhurried. Because now, I was no longer trying to make sense of my life as it had been. I was beginning to understand the one that had been happening around me without my knowledge. and I intended to see it all the way through. I woke up earlier than usual the next morning, not because I had slept well, but because my mind had already begun moving before my eyes opened. The house was quiet, wrapped in that soft early light that made everything look almost untouched, as if nothing complicated had ever happened within its walls. I moved through my routine the same way I always did. Coffee, toast, the morning news playing softly in the background, though I was not really listening. Routine matters. It keeps everything appearing unchanged, even when it is not. By 9 o'clock, I was dressed and ready to leave. I picked up my purse, making sure the envelope was inside, then paused for just a moment by the door. I did not hesitate. I simply acknowledged that something had shifted, and then I stepped outside. The bank was only a 10-minute drive from my house, a place I had passed many times without ever needing to go inside. It looked ordinary, like any other branch. Glass doors, clean floors, a quiet line of customers moving at a steady pace. I took a number and waited, my eyes moving calmly around the room, observing without appearing to. When my turn came, I stepped forward and greeted the young woman behind the counter with a polite smile. "Good morning," I said. "I would like to review an account that appears to be under my name." She nodded, professional and efficient, asking for identification, typing information into her system. I handed her what she needed without hesitation. After a few moments, her expression changed slightly. Not dramatically, just enough to signal that she had found something unexpected. "Yes, Mrs. Hayes," she said, turning her screen slightly. "This account is active." Active. The words settled into place quietly, but it carried more weight than anything I had heard the day before. "I see," I replied. "May I review the transaction history?" She nodded again and began printing the records. The sound of the printer was steady, mechanical, almost reassuring in its consistency. Paper after paper slid out, each one a continuation of the same pattern I had already seen. Deposits, withdrawals, transfers, all regular, all deliberate. I took the stack and thanked her, then stepped aside to a small seating area near the window. I sat down and began to read. This time, I was not looking for confirmation. I already had that. I was looking for direction. The deposits matched exactly what Mr. Bennett had shown me. $1,200 every month, without fail. But it was the withdrawals that mattered now. They were not random. They followed a pattern just as consistent. Within days of each deposit, the money was moved, transferred out in precise amounts, sometimes in full, sometimes in portions. Always controlled, always intentional. I traced one of the entries with my eyes, then another. The destination accounts were listed, different numbers, but one appeared more often than the others. Repeated, familiar in its repetition, even if I had never seen it before. I leaned back slightly, folding the papers together in my hands. This was not neglect. It was not confusion. It was management. Careful, structured, repeated management. And that meant there was someone actively directing it. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, not in frustration, but in clarity. Because now, I was no longer asking what had happened. I was beginning to see how it had been maintained. I stood up, walked back to the counter, and asked one more question. "Is it possible to see who has authorized these transfers?" The young woman hesitated, then explained that detailed authorization records might require a formal request, but certain information could be reviewed. She typed again, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. Then she looked up at me. "There is a secondary authorized user on the account," she said. Secondary. The word felt exact. Precise. "May I see the name?" I asked. She turned the screen slightly, just enough for me to read it. And there it was. Clear. Undeniable. Victoria Hayes. I did not react. Not outwardly. I simply nodded once, as if the information were expected, as if it confirmed nothing more than a simple administrative detail. "Thank you," I said. I gathered the papers, placed them neatly back into the envelope, and walked out of the bank the same way I had walked in. Calm, measured, unhurried. But as I reached my car and placed my purse on the passenger seat, I allowed myself one slow breath. Because now, the shape of it was clear. Not just the money, not just the account, but the structure behind it. Victoria had not stumbled into this. She had not accidentally benefited from a mistake. She had been positioned, given access, given control, and she had used it, consistently, without interruption, for 2 years. I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, my hands steady on the wheel. I did not feel the need to confront her. Not yet, because knowing was not the same as proving. And proving required more than a single name on a screen. It required timing. It required patience. It required allowing the pattern to continue just long enough to reveal itself completely. As I drove home, the road stretched out ahead of me, familiar and unchanged. But I was not the same person who had driven to the bank that morning. I was no longer searching for answers. I was building a case. Quietly, carefully. And this time, I would not miss anything. I did not contact Victoria that day, or the day after. I did not mention the bank, or the account, or the name I had seen so clearly on that screen. Instead, I continued exactly as I always had. I watered the plants in the morning. I folded laundry in the afternoon. I called Michael once, just to ask how his week was going. My voice was calm, familiar, unchanged. Busy, he said as he always did. A lot going on at work. I listened, the way I always had, offering small responses at the right moments. That sounds like a lot, I said. Make sure you are taking care of yourself. He thanked me, his tone distracted but polite. And then the call ended. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would raise concern. That was important. Because whatever had been happening had relied on one thing above all else. My silence. My trust. And I intended to use both of those, just a little longer. 3 days later, I returned to the bank. This time, I was not there to confirm anything. I was there to observe timing. Patterns only reveal themselves fully when you watch them more than once. I took a seat near the same window as before, the envelope resting neatly in my lap. I did not approach the counter right away. I waited. I watched. People came and went, their movements predictable, routine. And then, just before noon, I saw it. A transaction alert. Printed at the self-service station across the room. The same account number. The same routing code I had memorized without trying. It was subtle, something most people would not notice. But I had been looking for it. I stood up slowly and walked to the counter, my steps steady. I would like to review today's activity on my account, I said. The teller nodded and began typing. A moment later, she turned the screen toward me. There it was again. A deposit. $1,200. Processed that morning. Right on schedule. I felt no surprise. Only confirmation. And the outgoing transfers? I asked. She clicked through another screen. There has not been one yet today, she said. But based on the pattern, it may occur later. Later. I nodded once. Thank you, I said, stepping back again. I did not leave. Not yet. I returned to my seat by the window, my posture relaxed, my attention quiet but focused. Time passed slowly. 15 minutes. 20. 30. And then, just after 12:30, it happened. A transfer request. Initiated. Authorized. The same destination account I had seen before. The movement was clean, efficient, almost invisible if you were not watching for it. But I was. I stood again, approaching the counter for the second time. Could you confirm the authorization on that transfer? I asked gently. The teller hesitated, then nodded, checking the details. It was completed through online access, she said. Authorized by a secondary user. Secondary user. The phrase no longer felt abstract. It had a name now. A face. A pattern. I see, I replied. And I did. I understood now not just what had been happening, but how it had been sustained. Victoria did not need to hide it in complicated ways. She had positioned herself where she did not need to. The system had been set up cleanly, legitimately. She had simply used what had been given. Regularly. Quietly. Without interruption. I thanked the teller again and left the bank. The midday sun brighter now, the air warmer than it had been that morning. As I walked to my car, I considered the precision of it all. The timing. The consistency. This was not something done in haste or carelessness. It was done. With confidence. With the belief that it would not be questioned. And for 2 years, it had not been. Because I had not questioned it. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine, my hands resting lightly on the wheel. There was no urgency in me. No impulse to call, to confront, to demand an explanation. Because now, I had something far more valuable than suspicion. I had sequence. I knew when the money arrived. I knew when it left. I knew who had the authority to move it. And most importantly, I knew that it was still happening. That was the part that mattered most. Because as long as it continued, it could be documented, observed, proven. I started the car and pulled out slowly, merging into the steady flow of traffic. Everything around me moved as it always did. Cars passing, signals changing, people going about their day. Ordinary, predictable, but I was no longer moving through it the same way. I was no longer reacting. I was preparing, because whatever conversation was coming, it would not be based on assumptions or emotions. It would be based on something far more difficult to deny. And when that moment arrived, there would be no confusion left to explain. By the end of that week, nothing on the surface had changed, and that was exactly how I wanted it. I still called Michael every few days, still asked about his work, still listened to Victoria's carefully measured updates about their plans, their schedules, their lives. If anything, I became even more consistent. Predictable. Because predictability is what allows people to relax. And relaxed people do not look over their shoulders. On Sunday afternoon, I invited them over again. I thought we could have lunch this time, I said on the phone, my tone light, almost casual. It has been a while since we sat down during the day. There was a brief pause, the kind I had come to recognize. Then Michael agreed. That sounds nice, Mom, he said. We will be there around 1. They arrived right on time. Victoria stepped in first, her smile warm, her posture composed, as though nothing at all had shifted between us. It smells wonderful, she said, glancing toward the kitchen. Michael followed, offering me a quick hug before stepping back. You did not have to go through all this trouble, he added. I smiled. It is not trouble, I said. It is just lunch. We sat down together, the sunlight coming in through the windows, casting soft shadows across the table. It was a different atmosphere than dinner. Lighter, brighter, easier to disguise what lay underneath. Conversation moved the same way it always had. Safe topics, controlled pacing. Victoria led most of it, her voice steady, her words carefully placed. Michael followed her rhythm, nodding at the right moments, adding small details where needed. I listened, and I watched. Halfway through the meal, I reached for a small folder I had placed beside my chair. It was not the same envelope from before. This one was thinner, simpler, less noticeable. I placed it gently on the table, not pushing it toward them, just letting it exist between us. I stopped by the bank again, I said. The effect was immediate, though neither of them reacted outwardly in any dramatic way. Victoria's hand paused briefly above her glass before continuing the motion. Michael shifted slightly in his seat, adjusting his posture as if he needed to get more comfortable. Oh, Victoria said, her voice still smooth. Did they figure out what the issue was? I nodded once. They helped me understand the pattern, I replied. I did not open the folder yet. I let the word settle first. Pattern. It was a simple word, but it carried weight when placed correctly. Michael glanced at the folder, then back at me. What do you mean? He asked. I leaned back slightly in my chair, folding my hands together. The deposits arrive on the same day every month, I said calmly. And the transfers leave within hours. Sometimes minutes. Silence followed. Not empty silence. Tight silence. The kind that stretches just enough to reveal discomfort. Victoria set her glass down carefully. That does sound unusual, she said. But like we discussed, it could still be related to the old account setup. Could be. The same phrasing. The same distance from certainty. I nodded, as if considering her point. Yes, I said. That is what I thought at first. Then I opened the folder. Slowly, deliberately, I turned it toward them, revealing a single page. A timeline. Dates. Times. Deposits. Transfers. Each one aligned with precision. Each one impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Michael leaned forward, his eyes scanning the page more carefully this time. His expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough. Enough to show that something was no longer fitting the explanation he had been holding on to. Victoria did not reach for the paper. She looked at it from where she sat, her posture still composed, but her stillness now more controlled than natural. That is very detailed, she said after a moment. I nodded. Yes, I replied. It is. I let a few seconds pass before speaking again. Timing mattered now more than ever. I also asked about account access. I added, my tone unchanged. That was when it happened. Not a large reaction. Not something obvious. But enough. Victoria's gaze shifted, just briefly, toward Michael. A fraction of a second. Then back to me. It was quick. But it was there. And? Michael asked, his voice quieter now. I met his eyes directly. There is a secondary authorized user, I said. I did not say the name. Not yet. I did not need to. Not when the room had already begun to change. Because now, it was not about what I knew. It was about what they realized I knew. And that was something far more difficult to control. I closed the folder gently and rested my hands on top of it. I thought it would be best if we all understood exactly what is happening, I said. My voice remained calm, even, almost kind. But beneath it, something had shifted completely. Because this was no longer a quiet observation. This was the moment where the pattern stopped being invisible. And once something is seen clearly, it cannot return to what it was before. No one spoke for a few seconds after I said that. It was not a long silence, not in terms of time, but it was enough. Enough for the room to shift from something controlled into something uncertain. Michael looked down at the table again, but this time he did not seem to know where to place his eyes. His fingers rested against the edge of his plate, unmoving. Victoria, on the other hand, remained very still. Too still. Her posture was perfect, her shoulders relaxed, her expression composed. But there was something underneath it now. Something tighter. Something calculating. I think we might be overcomplicating this, she said finally, her voice smooth but slightly firmer than before. If there is a secondary user listed, it does not necessarily mean anything inappropriate happened. Sometimes accounts are set up that way for convenience. Convenience. The word hung in the air, carefully chosen, carefully placed. I nodded slowly, as if I were considering her explanation. That is true, I said. It can be convenient. I let the agreement settle, just long enough to lower the tension slightly. Then I continued. Especially when the transfers happen on the same day. At the same time. Every single month. Michael exhaled quietly, the sound almost unnoticeable, but it carried weight. He looked up at me then, his expression uncertain in a way I had not seen before. Mom, what are you saying? He asked. His voice was softer now, less certain. I met his gaze, holding it steady. I am not saying anything yet, I replied calmly. I am just showing you what I have seen. I tapped the folder lightly with my fingers, not forcefully, just enough to draw attention back to it. The deposits arrive. Then they leave. Always the same way. Always to the same place. Victoria shifted slightly in her chair, her hands folding together more tightly now. And you are assuming that I am responsible for that? She asked. There it was. Not denial. Not confusion. A question framed as a challenge. I looked at her, really looked this time, and for the first time, I did not see the version of her I had accepted for years. I saw someone who had been very careful, very deliberate. I have not made any assumptions, I said evenly. I have only confirmed who has access. Another pause. This one sharper. Michael turned toward Victoria, his brow tightening. Victoria, you are on the account? He asked. She did not answer immediately. That, more than anything else, changed the room. Because before, she had always been quick. Always ready. Now there was a delay. Small, but undeniable. I helped your father set things up, she said finally, her voice measured. He wanted to make sure everything was organized. He trusted me with the details. I listened carefully, not just to the words, but to what they avoided. And the transfers? Michael pressed, his voice gaining a slight edge. Victoria looked at him then, her expression softening just enough to suggest reassurance. Michael, we went over this, she said gently. The account may have been linked to an old system. If the funds were routed incorrectly, they were not routed incorrectly, I said quietly. The words were not loud, but they cut through the explanation cleanly. Both of them looked at me. They were accessed, I continued. Consistently. On schedule. For 2 years. The room went still again, but this time, it was different. There was no longer any space for easy explanations. No room for confusion. Only the shape of what had been happening, sitting plainly between us. Michael leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. I do not understand, he said, his voice strained now. Why would this even be happening? Victoria's eyes flickered toward him, just for a second. Then back to me. She did not answer him. She waited. Waiting, I realized, had always been part of her strategy. Let others speak first. Let them fill the silence. But this time, the silence did not move the way she expected it to. Because I did not rush to fill it. I simply watched. And that changed everything. I think, I said slowly, that we should not try to explain it all at once. I placed my hand lightly on the folder, grounding the moment. Some things are clearer when you look at them step by step. Michael nodded slightly, though it was clear he was still trying to process everything. Victoria remained composed, But her stillness now felt less like control and more like containment. "What do you want to do?" Michael asked me. The question lingered in the air, heavier than anything that had been said so far. I considered it for a moment, not because I did not know the answer, but because timing still mattered. "For now," I said, "I want to continue observing." I met Victoria's eyes as I spoke. Because patterns do not disappear overnight. They reveal themselves. I let that settle, watching carefully as the meaning reached her. And in that moment, I saw it. Not fear. Not yet. But awareness. The realization that this was no longer something she could quietly manage in the background. Because now, it was being seen. Clearly. Completely. And once something like that is exposed, it does not go back into the shadows. It only moves forward. Michael did not speak for a long time after that. He sat there, his hands clasped together, his eyes fixed somewhere between the table and the folder, as if he were trying to reconcile two versions of reality that no longer aligned. Victoria remained composed, but something in her expression had changed. It was subtle, but it was there. The confidence she had carried so easily before had begun to narrow, tightening into something more controlled, more deliberate. "Observing," she repeated, her voice steady, though quieter now. "What exactly does that mean?" I looked at her calmly, without urgency, without hesitation. "It means I am no longer ignoring what is in front of me," I said. The words were simple, clear. There was no need to add anything more to them. Michael leaned forward slightly, his voice lower than before. "Mom, if something is wrong, we should fix it. We should figure it out now." I turned my gaze to him, holding it just long enough for him to understand that I had heard him, that I was considering what he had said. "Some things are not fixed by rushing," I replied gently. "Some things need to be understood first." He nodded faintly, though it was clear that understanding was no longer something he felt certain about. The room had shifted too far for that. I reached for the folder and opened it one final time, not to introduce anything new, but to place everything clearly where it could no longer be moved or reinterpreted. I turned it toward them again, the pages aligned, the information precise. "The deposits began the month after your father passed," I said, my voice even. "They continued every month, without interruption. The transfers followed immediately. Always the same pattern. Always the same destination." I paused, letting each detail settle. "And the account has remained active the entire time." Michael closed his eyes briefly, exhaling slowly, as if the weight of it had finally settled fully into place. "Victoria," he began, but the rest of the sentence did not come. It did not need to. Victoria did not look at him this time. She kept her eyes on me, her posture still composed, but no longer untouched. "You are presenting this as if there is intent behind it," she said. "As if this was done deliberately." I held her gaze, steady and unbroken. "It was done consistently," I replied. "And consistency does not happen by accident." Another silence. This one did not feel uncertain. It felt final. Not because everything had been said, but because enough had. Michael sat back slowly, his expression no longer searching, but shifting into something else. Something quieter. Something more difficult to name. "I did not know," he said after a moment, his voice low. "It was not directed at me. It was not directed at anyone, really. It was simply spoken into the space that remained." I listened, but I did not respond to that. Because whether he knew or not was no longer the center of this. What mattered was what had been done, and what would happen next. I closed the folder gently and placed it back beside me. Then I folded my hands together, resting them calmly on the table. "I have already spoken with Mr. Bennett," I said. Both of them looked at me again. "The account will be secured," I continued. "The transfers will stop, and everything that has been moved will be reviewed properly." My tone did not change. It did not need to. The meaning was clear without force. Victoria's lips parted slightly, as if she were about to respond, but she did not. Not immediately. And in that hesitation, I saw it. Not fear. Not yet. But the recognition that control had shifted. That whatever had been quietly managed before was no longer within her reach. Michael nodded slowly, absorbing what I had said. "That makes sense," he replied, though his voice carried the weight of something heavier than agreement. I stood up then, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with quiet intention. The conversation had reached its natural end. There was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to soften. "You are both welcome to finish your lunch," I said, my voice calm. almost gentle. There is no need to rush. It was a simple sentence, but it carried everything it needed to. I turned and walked toward the kitchen, my steps steady, unhurried. Behind me, the room remained silent. Not empty, not uncertain, just quiet in a different way now. A settled kind of quiet. As I reached the sink, I paused for a brief moment, my hands resting lightly against the counter. I did not feel anger. I did not feel triumph. What I felt was clarity. Clean. Undisturbed. The kind that does not need to raise its voice to be understood. And as I stood there, looking out at the same quiet street I had seen so many times before, I allowed myself one final thought. I had not lost anything. I had simply stopped being unaware.